Well, Scott, thank you for that vision statement. And both as someone who's written a lot for The Economist and elsewhere about how do we solve as a planet some of the big challenges that we face, but also I'm a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Global Governance. And I think we look at this kind of public-private collaboration with great interest, because if it could be made to work, it could become a model for how the world goes forward in trying to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals that have just been adopted by the United Nations. Now, the goal of this panel, I think, is to explore, in reality, having had the vision statement, what in practice needs to happen to turn this idea of sustainable development into a reality, and what does that reality look like? And the panel members, couldn't be more expert on the topic. To my immediate right is Alexander Shestakov, who is director of the Global Arctic Program for WWF, and that's the environmental group, not the wrestling organization. Next to him is Jan Gunnar Winter, who is director of the Norwegian Polar Institute. Next to him is Dr. Daly Sambo Dura, who specializes in public international law, international human rights law, particularly with a focus on the human rights of indigenous peoples. Next to her is Mayor Shirley Marquardt, who is mayor of the city of Unalaska since 2004. And lastly, but by no means least, next to her is Damien Ardar, who works for Fortescue Metals Group, where he is in charge of Aboriginal development issues for the company. So I want to start with you, Mayor, because it does seem to me, as someone who doesn't live in the Arctic, there's a lot of questioning about the whole nature of development itself. The history of development in the region has not really lifted humanity up and made us feel good about what's happened. And this notion of sustainable development, a lot of people would say, why don't we just not develop it at all? Let's leave it as a beautiful, pristine place as much as it could be. So can you explain, as someone who lives and runs a town, what is the case for development, and what does sustainability look like for you?
Okay, well, thank you. For the state of Alaska, particularly on the west coast and the north coast up into the Arctic, there are extreme challenges, obviously, with weather within the environment and with infrastructure. We don't have connections to many of our communities. Many of our ports don't have connections to roads or to rail, et cetera. So in terms of infrastructure development to try and meet the demand of what's probably going to be happening in the Arctic, because somebody's going to do it. The Arctic is not going to stay a perfect, pristine, untouched place. It's a shiny bauble, and everybody wants it. That seems to be what I've heard over and over. So sustainability for my community, we're a fishing community. Sustainability means that year after year we know that we're going to have a strong, steady revenue stream, that we're going to fund our schools, that we're going to have a healthy social system in town, that we can fund our roads, our programs for our elders and our seniors. And by doing this, we want our partners, we want them to play by the same rules that we play by, which is responsibility, being responsible and being reasonable and planning things very well in advance. Communities in Alaska are very self-reliant and don't take well to people coming in and telling them, we're about to make your life better here. We're going to build this for you, and you can say thank you later. It doesn't quite work that way. But I think there's no doubt that Arctic development is coming, and it can be done in a responsible way. We've seen it.
So, and just give us a flavor of what that, for you, what is the thing that would differentiate responsible, sustainable development from just development?
Well, I suppose if there's an investment idea or a company who wants to come in and they have the idea that they're going to build a port project, build a port to serve their vessels, well, the community's got to support that port as well. The infrastructure there for the roads, for the electric, for everything that sustains that is going to have to be paid by everybody who lives in the community. So that might not be sustainable in the long run, particularly with some ports in the Arctic they've talked about are only going to be open 6 months out of the year. You really need to operate on a full-time basis in order to pay those costs. So companies who would come in and not try to first understand the region or the community that they're coming to, that would be a big problem. Trust is a big issue. There has to be trust in order for there to be a relationship, and that has to be a relationship to be a partnership if it's going to be successful. And it all comes down to going and talking to those people, getting to know them before you walk in with your big idea. They want you to know who they are and what's important to them. That's very, very important.
So, Daley, this issue for the indigenous peoples, I mean, is there a model of sustainable development that you think they have in mind, and is it pretty much what the mayor has just said, or are there significant differences?
Well, first of all, let me thank President Grimson, Alice, and all the others who have made this Arctic Circle gathering such an extraordinary event. In response, there are some elements that are absolutely consistent with the concerns of indigenous peoples. I would suggest that the title be Sustainable and Equitable Development on the part of indigenous peoples. And in terms of the characterizations that have been put forward on the part of indigenous peoples, I think that we should expand this notion of local people to include the distinct status and conditions of indigenous peoples in terms of their direct participation to ensure sustainable and equitable development in the Arctic. And I think that as Scott has said, the Arctic Investment Protocol is an important first step. And I was pleased to hear the terms minimal standards as well. In terms of corporate responsibility and their commitment to sustainable development in the Arctic, at present, I think that we have to be mindful of the need to intersect other important developments in the international community specifically related to indigenous peoples so that we can ultimately achieve sustainable and equitable development. And I think these important developments in the area of indigenous human rights need to be reflected in any Arctic Investment Protocol to ensure that corporations, private industry, gravitate toward genuine sustainable and equitable development through behavior consistent with human rights standards.
Alexander, you've written at length about the miserable history of development in the region and how it can't continue in the way that it has in the past. What do you feel that sustainable development, what's required that's going to be different if it's going to work? Particularly given the environmental challenges that the region faces.
Thank you for the question, and I probably will frustrate you around the previous questions you asked about keeping the Arctic just a park, a pristine area. Basically, we are not asking for that. So they definitely have 4 million people in the Arctic, and in this way it's not pristine, so it's actually occupied and developed for a long time. And at the previous session,
before you go on, I mean, just explain how an environmental group like WWF has come to that position, because I guess the movement as a whole in the past would not have been so open to development.
Oh, the vision for the future of the Earth in WWF is actually harmony of nature and people. And as we have people there, so we care of people. And that's why people require and they actually have a right for development, also up north, not only on the southern part of Arctic states. And idea of this protocol is very timely, for sure, and we fully support the idea of protocol. We definitely like to see that this protocol is going beyond existing standards for sustainability. I was mentioning a few principles already existing, and the question is whether those principles we have today are fully implemented. And that probably should be one of the questions, whether those businesses who already adhere to a potential or existing standards and principles, are they really implement them? Is there any kind of accountability system which ensures us that they do that before they jump into new protocol? And if we go for the new protocol, and again, I'd like to stress we fully support going for this kind of protocol, especially if this investment protocol will be really Arctic specific and will really address the key Arctic issues. But that's need to go beyond. I think what was good in presentation, and that's again hope, that companies operating in the Arctic will go beyond compliance. Because being in compliance, that's of course a must. That's just regulations. But what companies, and especially investment sector, can really do beyond that? Vision. If you go for investments, probably it's nice to have a target. And maybe we need to have a vision for Arctic in 2050, how we like to see it in 2050. And then think what kind of investments we need to achieve this target. Because it's not necessarily that every investment is good for the Arctic and for the environment. And before we're coming also to this protocol, or actually supplementary to protocol, we like to see this kind of vision. We like to see where companies like to invest.
And do you feel that vision is there at the moment? Do you have a vision as WWF for that?
Yeah, we have visions for 2020. We have vision for 2050. And we really like that community of Arctic states and beyond Arctic states. And if business is taking initiative, that's even better. Because I think the initiative itself, coming not from the government, coming not from environmental NGOs, but coming from the business itself, is absolutely positive step. But if you don't have targets, if you don't have clear outcomes we like to achieve, how measurable will be this protocol? What will be the reporting against this protocol? How that will be transparent? How people of the Arctic will be fully engaged, and engaged not only in discussion what's happened, but basically fully integrated into decision-making process around investments. So all those issues from our standpoint are really, really important if we like this protocol to be really working and for the benefit of the Arctic.
Great. Well, Jan Gunnar, you have two hats on, invisible hats today, but one is as a scientist and one from a perspective of the governments in the region. I mean, firstly, from a scientific perspective, I mean, one of the questions about sustainable development, you know, what does sustainability mean in a period of dramatic change, which we may be, you know, in the early phases of. And I just want you to talk a bit about the science and how we make sure that, as Scott suggested, this is a science-based concept of sustainability.
Thank you. President Grimson, distinguished audience, it's a great pleasure to be here. My first argument would be that we need a knowledge-based approach to development in the Arctic. This is also the center of the wheel of the High North policies in Norway. So all decisions, including investment, should be based on sound and healthy knowledge. Then I would make the argument that the Arctic is fundamentally under-investigated today. We all hear about achievements. Many more actors and nations and institutions are building up capacity and working harder in the Arctic than we used to do. But due to the short history of active scientific presence and data collection, and also the inaccessibility to this area to a large extent still, and the costly nature of the region, it is under-investigated as a region compared to most other areas in the world.
And so what would be the areas where we really don't have good information?
Marine ecosystems, climate change. I'm myself a climate scientist, and I must admit, unfortunately, that I and my community has consistently underestimated the pace and the rate of change in the Arctic. We still do, and it may be an example. When I entered into my position 10 years ago, I made a statement which was very progressive at the time, and actually provocated many. I said in 50 to 100 years we may see a transit of shipping between Asia and Europe, and I was totally mistaken, of course, but I was really challenging the established view 10 years ago. So the Arctic region needs knowledge, but there is a different, more global view to this, and that is that, and we heard that yesterday, through teleconnections, what we learn about the Arctic has a value globally. So by investing, for example, €1 in Arctic research, you will have a manifold return in domestic management. And then there is one more thing, which is very important to keep in mind, I think, when it comes to knowledge-based decision-making, including investment in the Arctic, is that this region is quite different from most other regions because of the rapid change, which means that yesterday's facts are not reflecting tomorrow's solutions. So we need a continuous data collection, a continuous research, and we need also to have dynamic management systems that are revisited and also refined and revised.
So let me just push you a bit on that, because there's also been reference, I think, in the protocol to how this notion of we don't want any learning by doing, we want to have clear planning. How do you reconcile that, the need for development, and this sense of just dramatic and unpredictable change? I mean, because I guess the need of being certain at a time when there is a lot of change would probably push you to go slowly on development, and yet there's clearly an issue that many people here want to move quite fast.
Well, I agree with the mayor that we will see a development in the Arctic. It's more a matter of how that development will happen. And nothing is perfect, so you cannot have all the answers when you start out with an initiative. But I think all new development should rest on the best available knowledge and data and facts that we have at hand at any given time. And then we, of course, don't know how future will develop. And we have been, as I said, consistently taken by surprise when it comes to the changes in the Arctic. And that is challenging us to make the right decisions today that have a long-lasting kind of stability and is robust for an unknown changing Arctic.
Mm. And then you have your other hat on as a government person. I mean, we're hearing a lot about the private sector leadership here, and how there's an attempt, obviously, to get the private sector to behave by the highest standards of sustainability. I mean, is there a consistent view, a pattern of behavior amongst the governments? Is there a united front there about what the government role should be and how governments want to work with the private sector?
Well, I mostly can speak for the Norwegian situation. There is a close collaboration between public and private actors. And there is also a close collaboration between government and companies, for example, when it comes to development of fisheries and petroleum, which are the two most important businesses in the north for Norway. And the balance between those are very carefully looked after in an integrated management plan that we established for the Barents Sea more than 10 years ago. But again, the dynamic nature of this, the sea ice, for example, is retreating in the Barents Sea, so more and more areas become accessible and available. At the same time, the biomass in the ocean is increasing. We have the highest quotas ever in this area. So this fine balance, which should be thoughtful and generous between different businesses, between different. There are many, many balances in this context. It's between the local communities and the national level. It's between international, international companies and the local ones. It's between northerners, indigenous people are representing about 10% of the people living in the north. There is also other local inhabitants. It's about short-term and long-term profit. And not speaking too much about Norway, but we are actually now in a situation where northern Norway has become an economical engine for Norway. So we turned this situation that we had before, that we were a deficit in the national budget, and the employment rates are higher. So it shows that the high north can become profitable.
I mean, but do you expect the Norwegian government to be enthusiastic about, say, the creation of the new permanent investment vehicle that's being proposed here? And do you see other governments in the region being enthusiastic?
The way the investment protocol, and I've been inside this group, has been working, and as Scott said, it's the first step. It's enhancing the level of standards. It's in line, I think, with how the Norwegian government is working to have a knowledge-based, sustainable, and balanced approach to development in the High North.
Alexander, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, you being a Russian, Russia's behavior as a sort of global citizen has been, not the best in recent years on some issues. Do you see it being a positive force in the implementation of this approach?
First of all, I'm not in a position like Jan, representing Russian government at all. Yeah? And I believe you had pretty a good session half an hour ago on these issues. And one important point, definitely from the session half an hour ago, as well as probably from the last ministerial meeting of the Arctic Council, is exactly around the point that what's happening in the Arctic currently and the level of cooperation in the Arctic and work between 8 Arctic states actually should stay shielded from whatever happens somewhere else down to the south or any other part of the world. So that's, I think, need to be a significant principle which we like to put into any kind of Arctic work. But so Russia is definitely in many ways will be a part of it. And many elements what's already happening, including approaches to some standards, are pretty similar as anywhere else. So what's I think important, and you partially mentioned it, I think that as a one piece to need to be really embedded into any kind of investment protocol in the Arctic for the future is definitely no learning by doing, but actually doing when knowing, when you have actually this kind of database, because that's not approach we can actually allow for the Arctic. Also, if we are thinking about investments in development, that's also interesting to know how those investments in development will be complemented by investments in science and knowledge, but also investments in conservation. They need actually come to hand.
So Damien, finally coming to you, and people may wonder, why have we got an Australian here on this panel? And you may be wondering that as well, but tell us what your reactions to some of what you've heard is, and you've been working very much with this question of sustainable development in communities where there are indigenous people, very much in your day job in Australia, but please.
Thank you. This is the Antarctic Conference, is it? No, sorry. So, President Grimston, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being given the opportunity to speak here today. You may wonder exactly why are we here. You'll find that there are similarities between the indigenous people of Australia and the Inuits in their lack of opportunity to access employment and economic development. And as a company in Australia, we've developed strategies and programs to address this, and these have now been adopted by the federal government and rolled out across the nation. And we've had visits from people in Greenland to come down and look at our programs to try and implement them up here in the Arctic as basically best practice.
So just tell us a bit about, what needs to be done by the private sector to actually win the trust of Indigenous people in the communities where you're operating?
Well, relationships are the very first point. I mean, you've got to spend time with the people and you've got to have consistency. What we did in the early days was change some of the language, which went from best practice or best endeavours or to actual targets that could be measured. And employment targets and economic targets through procurement, those things were what then drove the success.
And Daly, I mean, just from your perspective, do you want to build on that? I mean, what's this model of sustainable development going to have to do to get credibility with the Indigenous people?
Well, first of all, I want to comment on this notion that development will start, when in fact, in 1968, when oil was discovered on the North Slope of Alaska, we're talking about, at least in our experience, a long history of development. I mean, that discovery of oil triggered the pursuit of land claims and the adoption of the 1971 Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which recognized the rights of Arctic Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples throughout the territory of Alaska to lands, territories, and resources, including the subsurface rights. So we have had a long experience with this notion of development. So we're not on the cusp of development in the Arctic. We have had, in many cases, unfortunate experiences with regard to development. But in terms of the question that you pose, as I said earlier, I think that it's not only trust and relationships and dialogue, but also recognition of and respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples, and to enter communities with an understanding that they do have a distinct status and that their rights are distinct, as reflected in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, adopted by the UN General Assembly in September 2007, and also reaffirmed in the recent outcome document that emerged from the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. And I reference this outcome document specifically because it was a reaffirmation by all members of the United Nations to the standards, the minimum standards, to safeguard and protect Indigenous peoples well into the future. And obviously that is a major dimension to sustainability in the Arctic. And those rights in particular are the right to self-determination, which is regarded as a prerequisite to the exercise and the enjoyment of all other human rights. And if we understand the nature of human rights, they are indeed interrelated, interconnected, indivisible, and interdependent. And flowing from the right of self-determination, of course, is, as I've mentioned already in the context of Alaska, the rights to lands, territories, and resources. And I'm sure that in the case of Australia and Aboriginal peoples there, you've actually had, from my point of view, an uneven, at least on the part of the national government, uneven treatment of Indigenous peoples with regard to entrenching their rights to lands, territories, and resources. But in addition...
So let's pick up on that point. I mean, how much does this need to be driven by laws that demand these rights, or is this something we can expect companies to do without that kind of government pressure?
No, you need the laws at the forefront, and we have the Mabo decision that took place in 1996 in Australia, and that changed the landscape considerably. That gave Aboriginal people rights, the right to negotiate over their land. So you must have sign-off by the people before you start your operations. And that's what then streams down our programs and the outcomes. So that's what the foundations of our relationships are, those laws.
Shirley, I mean, you've recently I mean, Shell the other week has just sort of announced it's backing away from some of the work it was doing and looking to do in your area. And I wonder, you know, how much of this movement around sustainable development has to be away from looking at oil and natural resources towards building out other parts of the economy, and if so, you know, what bits are they, and what role might you see for the investment vehicle that's been proposed here?
Well, I think that in terms of Royal Dutch Shell, they were extremely good partners with our community and with our port in Dutch Harbor. We asked them to be engaged with us from the very start before they even realized how much they were going to be needing to use our port as the only deep water ice-free port on the entire coast up to the Chukchi. People would say, you're 1,100 miles away. Shell's not going to use you. And I said, well, where are they going to go? They have to come here. Everything that's going to go to the Arctic for the foreseeable future will come through a very few small places if it's coming up from the Alaska side. So we realized that, and again, we wanted to be very much engaged with Shell and realized very quickly that we needed to engage with their subcontractors just as strongly to make sure that they understood our community and understood what was important to us. And in terms of sustainable development in the Arctic, I think that a lot of the projects and ideas that you hear talk about, whether it's a port or it's a rescue response facility, it's going to come with a cost to the local community that has to be taken care of. In other words, if you build something in our community, if Shell was going to come in and their subcontractors were going to create places where they could get the milling, drilling mud and the cement and et cetera, they were going to have somewhere for those folks to live. So the immediate concern was people are going to be priced right out of their homes. And that actually started to happen a little bit. Shell didn't do any of that, but people assumed they would and just started raising prices on families who really had nowhere else to go because it's a tight market. So in terms of port, if you're looking for port infrastructure, you have to learn, you have to invest in that community as well. You have to invest in housing or in homes or in possibly the airport, you know, just all these different things. It's not just one piece. And we're talking a lot about moving very quickly, and I think we're talking about trying to bring down climate change, kind of do whatever we can. And I hope it's not that we're trying to develop the Arctic that quickly, because the big concern there is then that all of a sudden put a project out, instead of ready, aim, fire, it's ready, fire, aim. And that's definitely not going to work in the Arctic, as these gentlemen have said. So I hope that answered the question.
I mean, just to build on that, I mean, if we really are saying this has to be knowledge-based and not ready, fire, aim, I mean, what does that mean operationally as you think about how you put this protocol and the accompanying institutions into practice?
Well, there are a long way still to make up all the specifics and the final resolution of how to implement the protocol, and this is actually one step out of many to reach that goal eventually. So I don't think I should kind of speed up now and draw conclusions on that. But I would like to say that we probably all agree that we would like to see a sustainable development in a long perspective for the Arctic. But it's also very important for the Arctic community, us, to know that what happens in the Arctic is of global relevance. And one example is now that most of the climate models, they show that the biomass, the marine biomass, will increase in relatively cold waters, which means the Arctic areas, while it will be reduced in the tropical areas where most people live. So we will have a responsibility, you can say, simplify it, to feed the world in the future. You could have other examples on minerals and so on. But the development in the Arctic is of global relevance and global importance. Maybe it's a bad thing that the climate change hit the Arctic so fast and to such an extent. But one other way of looking at this is that this may have opened the eyes from the rest of the world that things are happening, and maybe that at the end of the day have some impact on the meeting in Paris. We should not forget either, I think that this unique area has a wilderness, a wildlife, and nature, and also an aesthetic value that is of global interest. And the third one is this scientific laboratory that actually has shown us what climate change can mean. And it's less than 10 years ago we really understood, we received evidence that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. This is really brand new in the longer, if you look at it from outside. So the Arctic has a critical place, so the development in the Arctic itself for the region is of crucial importance. However, we need to take this global responsibility because what we do with the Arctic matters.
Alexander, I mean, I just want to push you a bit more on, the vision for 2050, and to what extent is it about moving the economy of the region more towards feeding the world and less about mineral extraction and getting the oil out and so forth? I mean, I think there'll be a lot of people that say actually current trends you would see most of the development being more about mineral extraction, and that's something what alarms a lot of people.
It's also nice to see some shift in our discussions since last assembly last year, when most of presentations were oil and gas, shipping, a little bit of fishery. So it was clear trend. What are the investments in the Arctic? What's the future of the Arctic? Extractives, a little bit of infrastructure, transportation. That's it. That's probably the issue, and that's the issue for putting forward this idea of vision. We believe there are many other futures for the Arctic rather than to be extractive base exclusively. And that's what investors need really seriously consider. But also, as Jan mentioned, there are many wildlife, pristine ecosystems, and really rich natural capital in the Arctic. Do we know really what is a natural capital and ecosystem services in the Arctic today? The answer is no. That's one of those areas where the knowledge is actually miserable, and we need to know it. And if we go with any investment into the Arctic, we should fully recognize and incorporate the knowledge and understanding of natural capital there, and maybe to see how those investments can actually be built on that, can sustain it. And if we are thinking about the Arctic in the future as potential, it's already actually, it's 4 out of 10 major fisheries of the world. So 70% of white fish in Europe and the United States actually from the Arctic. So it's already feeding substantial part of the world, and it will continue. And can we sacrifice opportunities for that for actually pretty short-term interest in a couple of commodities? So we can't. And that's why, again, bringing us back. If you don't have this long-term vision, if the investments are not planned in long-term, instead of actually being short-term or being decided by election period of elected politicians, then we can't go actually far. And we can't ensure that the balance between development and prosperity of Arctic people, but also people outside the Arctic, will be in balance with the nature and the environment in the Arctic, how we like to see it, recognizing the fact that if what's happening in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic, then basically what's happening in the Arctic affects the rest of the world. And then responsibility is even higher in this case, and that again should determine what kind of investments we like to make.
Great. Well, we're pretty much in our coming to our final question before we ask President Grimson to speak. And I wanted to ask each of you, we've seen this vision of a collaboration around sustainable development in the region. Broadly speaking, as we move to the implementation phase, I want each of you to highlight the one thing that you particularly think is a priority to bear in mind as we go to that implementation phase, the thing that you're going to be looking for above all to be part of that next phase. And I'm going to start with with Daly. Why don't you go first on that?
I think that the key issue in terms of implementation is actually related to many of the statements that we've heard governments, not only the Arctic 8 nations, but also those governments who have become recent observers within the Arctic Council that, to borrow the term sheltering, I'll use the term siloing, indigenous rights, and for those governments, in terms of implementation, to take seriously this first step as far as an Arctic Investment Protocol, but intersecting it with all of these other important developments that are specific to indigenous peoples. And I mentioned the new observer status for a range of different governments, but also the governments that have presented here in the last couple of days and will continue to, that your international legal obligations cannot be siloed in regard to an Arctic Investment Protocol, in regard to any range of international agreements or international treaties. And I say this in large part because we've had difficulty with implementation of the rights of indigenous peoples by nearly every government on Earth, including those in the Arctic. And so the minimum standards reflected there should in fact be reflected in the Arctic Investment Protocol, and for governments in particular to take very seriously these minimum standards, but also corporations and private industry in order to really achieve the sustainability that we're looking for. And the final thing that I want to say is that there is interest, of course, on the part of indigenous peoples to partner with others as long as some of these minimum standards are in place and recognized and respected.
So, Jan Gunnar, briefly, one thing.
Yeah, time is short. Value creation achieved in the Arctic should benefit communities and residents of the region as well.
Alexander?
Clear targets and measurability of how we will progress with this protocol and with investments.
Damien?
I'd say transparency and incubating that development for economic development. So you've got to provide the partnerships and the guaranteed deployment.
And transparency in what sense, particularly?
That they companies put their numbers out there, their figures out there, the numbers of people they're employing, the numbers of the amount of money they're investing into companies. So it's not just a blur in the financial report at the end of the year. Have it up front. We do that. We provide $1.8 billion worth of investment in joint ventures with the Aboriginal people of Australia, just in the Pilbara. And that's, our target was $1 billion. So this is about the procurement process and having, but you also have to have the joint ventures to bring the people along the journey.
Should I give the last word to you?
Thank you. And in terms of public-private partnerships, they're fascinating. They're a new idea for us here in Alaska. We're very interested in them. And I would say on the implementation side, it's going to be interesting to see how this works. The private sector can move very quickly, and the public sector cannot. We're slow like an old blind donkey, but it's kind of for a reason, because we're spending the public's money. So in terms of the partnerships of what's a public funding source might see as the most important project to develop, might not be exactly what the private sector is looking for. So I hope to see a lot, the balance between there. And also, for the end, there was something that was said yesterday by the Chinese presentation here, win-win. And I think that that's an important key.
Great. Well, I think this has been a really fascinating discussion. I think it's highlighted that the vision outlined, I think, has people like the vision, but the next phase of implementation is going to be crucial, and the devil or the opportunity is going to be in the detail. And so I think this is going to be a subject that requires everyone to remain very engaged and focused over the months and years ahead. I'd like to thank the panel very much and invite President Grimson to come up and speak to us. So while you come up, Mr. President, a round of applause to the panel. Thanks.